as his vice presidential running mate. Pretty good move, because you could save your campaign. This is a guy that saved us $15 billion by doing this committee work and wartime production. So it makes sense. Well, we all know, you don't have to write this down, when President Roosevelt died in 1945, Truman became the nation's 33rd president. What you don't know is after he served the remainder of Roosevelt's term, he was elected to his own term in 1948. And could have run in 52. Could he have run in 56? Why? They didn't. Now, I'm just saying this because during the time that he served out the remainder of Roosevelt's term, one of the pieces of legislation that was passed was the 22nd Amendment to the United States Constitution, which we'll talk about later, that limited a president's term. So he would have actually been limited if he would have chose to run. The man that's first limited will be Dwight Eisenhower. But Truman would have been limited, but he chose not to run for re-election in 1952. Okay, we'll talk about that in a bit. So he is elected to his own term in 1948 after serving the remainder of Roosevelt's term. Well, during the time that he was serving his own term, he became very unpopular for two reasons. Because of the United States' involvement in the Korean War, but it wasn't so much our involvement in the Korean War as it was that he got sideways with somebody pretty important. What do you mean when you get sideways with somebody? Disagree, don't like him? Who did he get sideways with? That was a pretty popular World War II commander that will be involved in Korea. Everybody says Dwight Eisenhower, but it wasn't him. Douglas MacArthur. And I'm going to give you a prelude here, so don't write any of this down. My point is because of this disagreement and him not getting along with Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War, his popularity goes down, 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 and he chooses not to run in 52. What was the rift between him and MacArthur? Well, don't write this down. This is a prelude to what we're going to talk about. We have a problem in Korea. We've got the communists trying to take over the southern part of Korea. The North Koreans want to put communism in South Korea. And we're saying, no, no, no. So this whole thing we call a war really isn't a war. It's a police action because it's going to be fought under United Nations command. Nobody's declaring war on anybody else. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, Truman gives MacArthur overall command, and he goes in there and kicks butt, and he pushes those communists right out of South Korea, clear up to North Korea. And he's not satisfied. He wants to get all of it, including maybe China. And there's a Yalu River that's the border between North Korea and China. And the Chinese are all alarmed by this move by the Allies, and they say, Mr. MacArthur, you stay away from the Yalu River. If you get close to the Yalu River and get close to China, we will attack. Well, he's too arrogant, and he presses. China enters. All of a sudden, now in a short period of time, he's backed all the way down to the bottom corner of South Korea. So he loses everything he gains because of greed. Well, he's mad. So what's he want Truman to do?
Start a war.
He already got a war going. He wants to end the war.
Oh,
He wants him. He hints and starts to campaign for the use of an atomic bomb. And Truman says, "No way, Jose." Been down that road before. And MacArthur goes out publicly and starts to criticize the president. And you know what the president does? Fires him. He leaves MacArthur of his command. He's got a lot of support, MacArthur does. Truman's popularity, even though he did the right thing. That's a real prelude to what we're going to talk about. Well, anyway, the point is that President Truman's popularity was hurt badly by his poor relationship with popular World War II General Douglas MacArthur, and as a result of that, he decides not to run for re-election in 1952, and instead goes and retires to his home in Independence, Missouri. Okay? Now, what do presidents do after they retire? Josh? They write their memoirs, and they also plan for the construction of what? A presidential library. Those are the two things the president does. Okay? Normally, is they write their memoirs, and then they make arrangements for the construction of a personal presidential library, normally which goes in their hometown. Well, in 1955 and 1956, Truman's memoirs are published in 2 different volumes. And the volumes are, Volume 1, Year of Decisions, and number 2, Years of Trial and Hope. These are first edition, first printings. Okay, of Truman's memoirs. Now, let me give you another little prelude to history. In March of 1963, what happens at the Lincoln Memorial? I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. And as they're standing there, a young man by the name of George Raveling, who's a student at Georgetown on the basketball team, is hired to be one of King's bodyguards as he's given the speech, and he's standing next to him, just standing there. And Martin Luther King Jr. goes through his speech, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. And he hands his speech to George Raveling. George Raveling takes the speech and puts it away for safekeeping for almost 20 years. You know where he puts it? Inside his copy of Years of Decision. 20 years later, he pulls it out and figures out the magnitude of the speech. Still has the speech today. It's worth millions of dollars. He will not sell it. That'll be another story when we get into that. So when we get back to Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, and I show you the video on George Raveling, you'll see these books is where he stored the famous speech that he has today, the original. 55, these memoirs, it's on your ID sheet, Years of Decisions and Years of Trial and Hope, were both published, the first one in 55, the second one in 1956. Finally, in 1957, the Harry S. Truman Library opens in Independence, Missouri. It's quite a thing, I've been there. And finally, in 1957, the construction is completed, and the opening of the Harry S. Truman Library in Independence, Missouri occurs. Well, Truman leads a pretty obscure life. 2 things he gets himself kind of involved in between the time he leaves the presidency and his death. One was his criticism of John F. Kennedy being elected President of the United States. He didn't believe John Kennedy was old enough to assume that position, didn't have enough experience, and actually spoke out against his election. However, when the president was assassinated, he made another small appearance, and he was asked by a reporter, do you have any words of advice for now President Lyndon Johnson after this tragic assassination of John Kennedy? And he said, if the president wants my advice, he'll ask me about it. Okay, he won't be taken over by reporters and criticized like you boys did to me when I was president. Harry Truman was the guy that coined the phrase, the buck stops here. He could tell you to go to hell and you would enjoy the trip. I mean, he was a plain-spoken, no-nonsense, sometimes presidential acting man who had a little bit of a temper. He actually had one of these, this is a replica, on his desk in the White House that says the buck stops here, which means that everything ends at this desk. Any excuses, any blaming, anything that has to have a final decision ends here. And he was also proud that he could turn it around and it would say, I'm from Missouri. Okay, but the buck stops here. This is a replica of what sat on his desk in the White House. Okay, he was really quite an individual as far as plain speaking and saying how it was. Well, after leading a relatively quiet life after the White House, on December 5th of 1972, President Truman became ill and entered a local hospital with severe lung congestion. On December 5th of 1972, President Truman enters a local hospital with severe lung congestion. Unfortunately, 3 weeks later, the day after Christmas, on December 26, 1972, President Truman dies of complications at the age of 88. So as a result of the complications of his lung congestion, President Truman dies 3 weeks after admitted to the hospital the day after Christmas on December 26, 1972, at the age of 88. He is presently buried with his wife at his side at the Harry S. Truman Library in Independence. Pretty cool. You go to the library, you can see all his memoirs, mementos, different types of memorabilia, and then he is buried on the grounds next to his wife. It's pretty cool. Quite a character. All right, that will end our lecture today, but I got something special I kind of want to show you. And that is dealing again with this issue over Brett Kavanaugh and his Supreme Court thing.